The ash was still smudged across her fingers when the beta captain caught her crouching behind the grain cellar door. Her shoulder pressed against the rough-hewn wood, her breath shallow and controlled the way she had learned to breathe when she needed to disappear inside herself. She had been drawing again. Captain Heron grabbed her by the collar of her work dress and hauled her upright with the same effort a man uses to lift a sack he has already decided does not matter. Her feet found the floor, her hands curled against her sides. She weighed almost nothing, which was a fact that had long since stopped surprising anyone at Ashfeld Keep, including her. "The north corridor," he said, jerking his chin toward the hallway beyond the cellar arch. Again. The drawing was still damp. She had done it with the flat edge of a charred stick she kept tucked inside the waistband of her apron, one of the cooking sticks from the fire pit that burned pine resin and left a residue thick enough to mark stone if you pressed hard enough. She was efficient about it. She had been doing this for months. The image on the wall was not a picture exactly. It was more like a map, a schematic. The granary east wall, rendered in careful cross-sections, the support beams sketched in their actual positions, and across the longest beam, in lines so precise they might have been measured, a series of diagonal fractures she had noticed 3 weeks ago when they had sent her to clear out the old barrels. Heron stared at the wall. He stared at her. She looked back at him with the flat, steady patience of someone who had run out of fear several years ago and replaced it with something quieter and more durable. Her name was Vesper, or at least that was what the keep called her. The name she had arrived with, a thin girl of 6, delivered to Ashfeld's gates by a traveling trader who had collected her from a pack dissolution at the eastern border and had apparently decided that leaving her here was the simplest solution to a problem he did not want. She had no wolf, she had no voice. She had ink-dark hair and steady hands and a particular gift for seeing the structural integrity of things, buildings, people, situations, and understanding exactly where the breaking point was. "Clean it off," Heron said. He was not a cruel man. He was a tired one. There is a difference, and Vesper had learned early to tell them apart. Before the steward's morning walk, she cleaned it off. She always cleaned it off. She used a wet rag and the flat of her palm, working the ash out of the stone's grain in long, even strokes. The wall was left slightly darker than it had been before, a ghost of the image beneath, but you would only see it if you knew to look. Most people did not know to look. The warning she had tried to give them was this. The east granary beam was compromised at the load joint. In 6 to 8 weeks, depending on snow accumulation, it would fail. The roof section above it would come down, and anything stored beneath it, or anyone working beneath it, would be buried. 3 weeks after she first drew the schematic, the pack's head builder had walked through the granary for an unrelated inspection and had stopped in front of the east wall with a particular expression on his face, the expression of a man who has just seen something he does not want to have seen. He had filed a report. The steward had read the report. The beam had been braced. No one had connected this to the drawing on the wall. No one had connected any of the drawings to anything, because acknowledging that the mute girl who sorted grain and washed linens had been rendering accurate structural assessments of the pack's infrastructure in charcoal on the north corridor wall would have required the pack to acknowledge what Vesper was, and the pack had decided long ago what she was. Useful in the way furniture is useful. Present the way a draft comes through a gap in the wall is present. Not something you look at directly. She had been drawing for 9 months. The collapsed bridge support she had mapped 4 months ago, identified before anyone else noticed the rot eating through the eastern piling. The well cover that she had sketched from below after she lowered herself on a rope to retrieve a dropped bucket, noting the stress fractures around the iron fixtures in her careful, systematic way. The pack healer's supply room, which she had drawn not for structural reasons, but because she had overheard, while invisible as usual, that the medicines were being diluted and the concentrated stock sold north. and she had documented every shelf, every bottle, every discrepancy in her wordless, methodical way. None of her warnings had been in words. She had never written words, not because she could not. She could write, had taught herself from watching the steward's correspondence over years of being overlooked in his office, but because words required acknowledgement. Words required someone to look at her directly and receive something from her, and the pack had stopped doing that a long time ago. But drawings were different. Drawings could be absorbed, noticed, acted on, even if no one admitted they had seen them, even if the response came in the form of a builder filing a report and a steward ordering a brace and no one ever saying the word her. She was useful in this way. She mattered in this way, even if the mattering had no face and no name attached to it. She finished cleaning the wall, gathered the bucket, and padded back to the kitchen on bare feet that had long since toughened beyond the point of cold. The keep was quieter than usual for this hour. The beta warriors were not in the training yard. The kitchens were operating on a skeleton crew. The steward's office had lights burning that should have been extinguished an hour ago. Something was different tonight. She found out what at dawn, when the head cook grabbed her by the elbow before she could reach the linen closet. Up, listen. The cook's name was Aldis, a broad woman with a voice built for quarries and a manner that was relentlessly practical. She had on 4 separate occasions left food at the edge of the prep counter where Vesper could take it without anyone needing to see the transaction happen. She had never spoken about this directly. Vesper had never thanked her for it in any way that required Aldis to respond. It was the economy of people who understood each other without language. The Alpha King arrives today for the border review. Every pack in this region is on his rotation. Do you understand what that means? Vesper understood. She understood in the particular way she understood things, not through what people told her, but through what she had assembled from fragments. The Alpha King's reviews were not ceremonial. They were not the perfunctory inspections that pack alphas staged for subordinates. They were audits. The Alpha King, his name was Sorin. She had heard it in the steward's corridor 3 months ago, and it had lodged in her memory with a particular weight of information that feels significant before you know why. Arrived with a team and went through the records and looked at the infrastructure and asked about tribute numbers, and packs that had things to hide had to hide them quickly or not at all. Ashfeld had things to hide. Vesper had been documenting them for 9 months. Aldis gave her a long look before leaving for the main kitchen. Stay in the workroom. They don't want service staff visible during arrival. You understand? A pause. Something flicker in the cook's broad face that was not quite guilt and not quite protectiveness, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. Stay. Vebard nodded. She waited 60 seconds after Aldis's footsteps faded. Then she pulled the charred stick from her apron and went looking for a wall. She chose the receiving corridor, the one the Alpha King's retinue would walk through first, moving from the main gate to the great hall. The stone here was pale granite, almost white in the torchlight, and ash showed on it clearly. She worked fast, the way she had learned to work, each mark deliberate, each line placed with the precision of someone for whom communication had always been a resource to be spent carefully, never wasted. She drew the granary schematic again, updated, with the brace location marked and the load calculation she had worked out in her head over the course of several nights. She drew the supply room, the medicine shelves, the labeled bottles and the substituted ones. She drew the tributary ledger discrepancies she had seen over Steward Vaughn's shoulder 6 weeks ago when he had left her waiting in his office and forgot she was there. The columns that did not balance the way he had written them to balance, the fighters listed as casualties who she had seen alive and working in the northern quarry on the supply run she had been sent on and not been expected to pay attention to. She stepped back. The drawings covered nearly 15 feet of wall. She had never put this much in one place before. It felt different, doing it this way, less like dropping a stone in water and walking away, more like standing still and saying, "Look at me," more like a voice. She was still looking at the wall when she felt it, a change in the air, a pressure shift, like the moment before weather turns, when the quality of silence becomes something you can feel against your skin. She had felt something like this once before. A long time ago, when she was very small and a storm had come in from the eastern mountains so fast that the birds went quiet before a single cloud appeared. She had stood in the yard of whatever place she had been in then and felt the atmosphere change around her and understood that something large was coming. She felt that now. She did not know what it meant. Her knowing was not words or visions. It was physical. It was the hairs on her forearms lifting. It was the pull behind her sternum, deep and directional, like a needle swinging toward a compass point that had not existed until this moment. She ran. She made it back to the kitchen workroom and pressed herself into the corner behind the salt barrel, and she was still pressing ash off her fingers onto the back of her apron when she heard the horns from the watchtower. Two long, one short, the signal for a high-ranking arrival and the thunder of boots crossing the main courtyard in formation. Through the workroom's narrow window, she watched. The pack assembled in their ranks. Pack Alpha Merrick at the head, tall and ceremonial in armor that fit him badly because he had put on weight since his last inspection and was hoping no one would notice. Steward Von half a step behind, his face arranged in the practiced neutrality of a man doing rapid calculations. And then Sorin walked through the gate. He came on foot, no horse, no ceremonial approach. He wore dark traveling clothes, not formal wear, and he moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had stopped performing a rival a long time ago. He was younger than she had expected, not young, exactly. The lines around his eyes were real, earned, but younger than the image she had built from second-hand descriptions. His hair was dark. His jaw was set. He had a scar that ran from his right temple into his hairline, and his eyes, even from this distance, were the pale amber grey of old glass, held up to light, and they moved across the assembled pack with an attention so steady and flat it read less like assessment and more like recognition. A man who had seen this particular formation of deference and concealment so many times he could identify the weak points from across a yard. He stopped walking. He stopped mid-stride the way animals stop when something crosses their senses that their brain has not yet named. His head turned, not toward Merrick, not toward the formation, toward the kitchen block, toward the workroom window. Toward her, his nostrils flared once. He said something to the woman beside him, close-cropped silver hair, healer's satchel across one shoulder, the look of a person who had stopped being surprised by anything about 3 decades ago, and the woman looked at the kitchen block and then back at him, with the expression of someone receiving an instruction she had not anticipated and had already decided to follow. Merrick stepped forward with his greeting. Sorin looked at him the way you look through a window when what you want is on the other side of the glass. "I'll hear the briefing inside," Sorin said. His voice crossed the courtyard without effort, the particular carrying quality of a man who had never needed to raise it. After. He walked past the pack Alpha, past the formation, past the steward and the warriors and the assembled civilians. He walked directly toward the kitchen door. Vesper pressed herself against the wall, her shoulder connected with the salt barrel, and it rocked on its base with a sound that was definitely too loud, and she grabbed it and held it, and made herself small in the corner, which she was very good at, which had kept her safe for years. The door opened quietly. His footsteps on the stone floor were measured and deliberate. She could track them from where she was, and she did, pressing her back against the wall, her hands flat on the stone, while the footsteps moved through the kitchen and stopped on the other side of the salt barrel. She could feel him there. It was not a metaphor. The pull in her sternum, which had been a mild, strange pressure for the past 20 minutes, intensified abruptly into something that made her breath catch. "I know you're there." His voice was different close up. The flat authority was still present, but underneath it was something else. Something that sounded, impossibly, like a man trying to keep his hands steady. I can smell ash and cold stone, and underneath those—" He paused. "Something else. Something like the air before lightning, when the charge is building and the ground has already started to understand what's coming." She did not move. "Come out." Not an order, not quite. The space between an order and a need, which is a space she had not known existed until this moment. She came out. She stepped around the barrel, and the pantry was suddenly very full of him. His height and his warmth and the smell she had felt before she saw him. And she looked up and he looked down, and something happened that she had no language for and no framework to contain. A sensation that started behind her sternum and traveled outward through every nerve, simultaneously, like a wire pulled taut, suddenly given something to transmit. He said nothing for a long moment. His eyes moved across her face with the same steady attention he had directed at the courtyard, but this was different. The courtyard had been assessment. This was something that looked like recognition. "Who did this to you?" he asked. She stared at him. Her hands were at her sides, fingers slightly curled. She could not answer him the way he was asking her to answer. She had not spoken a word in her life. Not since whatever had happened to her voice before she arrived at Ashfeld, an absence so complete and so ancient that she did not experience it as loss, only as fact, only as the shape of herself. She could not tell him about Merrick's indifference or Vaughn's practiced cruelty, or the beater who had broken 2 of her fingers in a door when she was 9 because she had been standing in the wrong place at the wrong time and had failed to move quickly enough. She could not tell him about the root cellar they had locked her in for 4 days after the first drawing, or the kitchen door she was not allowed to use, or the 15 years of cold and invisibility that had built her into this quiet, precise, self-sufficient thing pressed against a wall in a workroom behind a salt barrel. She could not tell him any of it, but she could show him. She held up her right hand, fingers splayed, and then curled 2 of them inward into their still imperfect alignment, the middle and ring fingers that had never fully straightened after the bone had been allowed to heal on its own, unset and unsupported, by a healer who had not been called because no one had thought to call one. His expression did not change. That was the thing she noticed. He did not flinch or look away or make the small compassionate sound that people sometimes produced when confronted with evidence of old damage. The sound that meant, "I am registering this without meaning I intend to do anything about it." He looked at her hands the way she looked at load-bearing walls, with the full weight of his attention, with the intention of understanding. "Show me the rest," he said. She turned and walked out of the workroom, through the kitchen, down the passage, past the great hall where Merrick could be heard inside, talking too quickly to someone, and into the receiving corridor where the torchlight was steady, and the pale granite walls held 15 feet of her drawings in grey-black ash. He stopped. He read. She watched his face the way she had learned to watch faces. The micro-shifts, the muscle at his jaw, the quality of stillness that moved through him as he went from one drawing to the next. She watched his hands form fists at his sides when he reached the ledger section. She watched his eyes change when he found the drawing of the supply room, the bottles, the medication discrepancies. She watched him crouch down when he reached the far end of the corridor where she had, without quite planning to, sketched something in the lower corner where the wall met the floor. A small drawing, careful and deliberate, just her own hands in their actual shape. The crooked fingers, the calluses, the ash stains, rendered with the particular accuracy of someone who had spent a long time looking at them and understanding them as the tools that had built everything else in this corridor. He stayed crouched for a very long time. "How long?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not commanding, not Flan who has asked a question he already knows the answer to and needs it confirmed anyway. She held up 9 fingers. 9 months. She nodded. He stood. He turned to face her, and the amber grey of his eyes in the torchlight was the color of old glass, and they were very fully on her. "I'm looking, not listening," because he understood, somehow already, that listening was not what she needed from him. She needed to be seen. She needed someone to stand in front of 15 feet of her careful, wordless, persistent effort to matter and say, "I see what you did here. I see that you did not stop." The heat behind her eyes was sudden and unexpected. She had not cried in years. She had made the decision not to cry somewhere around the age of 12, when she had understood that crying required an audience invested in your distress, and she had no such audience. There was no return on the expenditure. She had simply stopped, but he was looking at her. He was standing in the corridor of her 9 months of silent, documented testimony, and he was looking, and the pull in her chest was so warm and so foreign and so entirely unlike anything she had ever felt that something in the architecture of her composure, which she had built with the same precision she brought to her drawings, developed a hairline fracture. One tear. She felt it the moment it started and killed it halfway down her face with the back of her wrist, an angry reflex. He reached out slowly, slowly enough that she could have stepped back, and they both knew it. His hand was large, the knuckles scarred, and he touched the side of her face with a gentleness so careful it barely registered as contact, his thumb moving along the line of her jaw. "Who set these fingers?" he asked. She shook her head. The muscle in his jaw moved. He was still holding her hand when the footsteps came, multiple sets, rapid, the clank of formal armor being moved in a hurry, and the high, thin sound of Merrick's voice pitching towards something between authority and panic. "Your Majesty, the northern wing is being... This area is... If you would allow us to show you to the..." Merrick rounded the corner and stopped. The drawings were behind Sorin. Merrick's eyes moved past him, found them, and the color left his face in the specific way blood leaves a face when the body has redirected it to more urgent purposes. Von was a step behind, and his reaction was different. His eyes went to the drawings and stayed there, reading, and his expression went not pale but calculating, the face of a man still sorting options. "She is disturbed," Von said. He had good timing. He had clearly thought about this possibility. The mute girl. She has been defacing the keep's walls for months. Paranoid imagery, obsessive repetition. We have tried to manage it, but she doesn't respond to ordinary correction. Sorin did not release Vesper's hand. "The granary beam," he said conversationally. "Was it repaired last month?" Silence. "The east well cover. Was it replaced in autumn?" More silence. "The bridge piling." He paused. "Who filed the structural report that triggered the repair order?" Von's expression faltered. The options he had been sorting through were dwindling visibly. "I would like," Sorin said, in the tone Vesper had heard him use in the courtyard. Flat, final, the voice of someone who has already decided the outcome and is offering the formality of a process, to see the tribute ledgers. Now, all of them, and the contracts for the quarry operations. Merrick looked at Von. Von looked at the floor. Neither moved. Sorin released Vesper's hand. He let her fingers slide from his slowly, and he gave her a look that said stay as legibly as a written instruction. Then he turned to face the Pack Alpha and the steward, and the temperature in the corridor seemed to change, though nothing had moved. "Choose quickly," he said. They chose. The woman with the close-cropped silver hair was named Osin. She was the Alpha King's chief record-keeper, and she moved through Ashfeld's administrative office with the focused economy of someone conducting a demolition. She found the ledgers, she found the contracts, she found the names. 41 fighters listed as dead in the tribute records who were very much alive and working 12-hour shifts in the northern quarry at wages that went to an account shared between Merrick and Von. Sorin read through the evidence without speaking. Vesper stood in the doorway of the office. No one had told her to leave. No one had told her she could stay. She occupied the familiar ambiguity of being neither excluded nor included and watched, because watching was what she had always done, and she was very good at it. He looked up at her 3 times over the course of the hour. Each time he found her in the doorway, something moved in his expression that was too small for anyone else in the room to catch. But she caught it. She had been reading faces in periphery for 15 years. He was checking that she was still there. When he finished, he closed the last ledger with a sound like a door shutting forever. "Pack Alpha Merrick," he said. "You are relieved. Effective now." He looked at Vaughn. "The same." He looked back at the room. "She comes with me." Merrick's mouth opened. "She is pack property bound in service. She is my mate." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Merrick stopped. Vaughn's composure, which had held through the entire ledger review, came apart at the seams for exactly 3 seconds before he disassembled it. Osin's eyebrows moved approximately 2 millimeters upward, which Vesper would later understand was the equivalent of her falling out of her chair. "She comes with me," Sorin repeated. "That is the end of the discussion." Vesper felt her legs go uncertain beneath her. She put one hand on the door frame to steady herself. The pull in her chest, which had been a warmth since the moment he had found her in the workroom, intensified into something that moved like light through a room that had been dark long enough to forget the difference. He crossed the office to the doorway. He stood in front of her and his eyes were fully on her, only on her, and she realized she had never in her life had someone's full attention and felt that it was safe. "There's a supply wagon outside the east gate," he said. "Osin will take you there. You'll eat. You'll rest. No one will put hands on you." She wanted, for the first time she could recall, to make a sound. Not words, not yet, maybe not ever, but something. Some acknowledgement of what was moving through her that had no form in her existing vocabulary of gesture and drawing and patient, precise silence. She raised her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, over the place where his heart was beating fast beneath the wool of his coat. Much faster than his face suggested. He covered her hand with his. "I know," he said. "I know." Osin materialized beside them with the efficiency of someone who had handled improbable situations for many years and had developed a methodology. "Come on," she said. "There's lamb stew. My king hasn't touched it, which means it's actually edible." The wagon was warm. There was a brazier bolted to the floor, and the seat was covered in worn leather, and Osin poured cider from a flask and set a bowl of stew on the fold-down table without ceremony and without any expectation of conversation. Vesper ate 2 bowls. It was the best thing she had ever tasted, not because of the stew, but because of the warmth, and the bowl that was hers, and the fork that was placed beside it as if her using a fork were the most natural thing in the world. "He's been looking," Osin said eventually. She was reviewing documents on a small tablet she held in her left hand, not looking up. 2 years. His wolf started behaving like a compass needle without a magnetic field about 24 months ago, restless, howling at nothing. A pause. He started conducting the border reviews personally after that. He's visited 163 packs. Vesper set down her spoon. "Until today," Osin said, and looked up. Her eyes were dark and direct and completely without sentiment. "Whatever you are, you're what he was looking for. I've worked for him for 11 years. I've never seen him walk past a pack, Alpha, without a word. A beat. I thought you should know." Vesper touched her throat, the hollow of it where a voice would sit if she had one. Osin read the gesture with the efficiency she applied to everything. "We have a specialist at the Capitol. If something can be done about your voice, she'll find it. If it can't, she'll tell you clearly and help you find alternatives." Another beat. "Either you won't be made to feel that you should apologize for it." Vesp slept before she meant to. The warmth and the food and 15 years of vigilance releasing all at once folded her sideways onto the bench, and she was unconscious before she finished the motion. When she woke, it was late afternoon. Sorin was sitting across from her reading a thin document by the window light, and when she stirred, he looked up. 4 hours, he said. "We made camp early." She sat up slowly. The wagon smelled like him now, cold air and something sharp and clean, pine and the particular metallic quality of a storm that has not yet broken. She breathed it in involuntarily, and the pull in her chest settled into something that purred in her ribcage. He folded the document. "The drawings," he said. "Osin photographed all of them before we cleaned the wall. 9 months, 47 separate images." He paused. Every one was accurate. Every structural warning, every documentation discrepancy, every supply room annotation. Accurate, specific, and… He stopped. She waited. There is a pattern, he said, in every drawing. Your hand. There is a signature mark in the lower left corner of each image. Not a name. A symbol. The same one every time. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. It looks like a V crossed with a downward curve. I had Osin look at it for 20 minutes before she told me what it was. He paused. It's a stylized V, your initial, embedded in every drawing, not as a label, woven into the shading, the line work, invisible unless you know to look. You signed every document in a hand that said, I was here. This came from me. She stared at him. Did you know you were doing it? She had not known, she had not chosen it consciously. She had simply drawn what needed drawing, and some part of her below the level of decision had woven something else into the work, a claim, a presence, the smallest possible version of a name. She shook her head slowly. 47 drawings, he said, his voice quieter now. 47 times you signed your name into work that was saving lives in a place that had treated you like furniture. You were present in every one of them, undeniably, precisely, specifically present. He sat back. His expression was not pity and not wonder, but something that occupied the space between them, the face of a man looking at evidence of a will so persistent it had simply worked around every obstacle placed in front of it. That is not something a person without power does, he said. That is not something an ordinary mind does automatically. That is a wolf. Your wolf marking everything you touched, trying to exist. She pressed her hand against her sternum. She could feel something there. Not the pull toward him. That was always there now, warm and constant. Something underneath it. Something that moved when she breathed deeply. A presence she had always attributed to the hollow feeling of having no wolf, and was only now beginning to consider might be a wolf that had simply never been let out. I am going to find out what happened to you, he said, not who was negligent, not who was unkind. Someone made you like this. Voices don't go absent, wolves don't go dormant. Something was done to you, Vesper, and I am going to find out who did it and why. The tears came without warning. She was not a person who cried. She had made herself not be that person a long time ago. But the tears came anyway, 2 of them, sliding down her face, and she did not wipe them away this time. He did not move toward her. He did not try to hold or console or reduce what she was feeling into something manageable. He sat across from her and stayed fully present in the space, which was exactly right, which was the thing she had not known she needed until he gave it to her. He stayed. They traveled for 4 days. Vesper rode in the wagon, ate 3 meals a day, and slept on a narrow mattress that someone had packed with wool batting and covered in clean linen, and every evening Sorin came to the wagon at dusk and sat with her while the light changed. He talked. He was, she discovered, a man who had learned to exist mostly in silence and had a great deal of accumulated speech stored up that came out in the evenings, when there was someone he trusted to hear it. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 16 and who had kept a journal of architectural drawings, buildings she had visited, structures she had admired, her own designs sketched in pencil in the margins. He told her about his wolf, a grey beast so large that palace historians had found a reference to a wolf of similar description in records 200 years old, suggesting either a bloodline trait or a very old name for something the records did not fully explain. He told her about the searching, the 163 packs, the growing conviction that whatever his wolf was looking for did not exist, that he was tracking a feeling rather than a fact, that the distinction might not matter. He talked. She listened, and sometimes she opened the journal Osin had given her on the first day, a proper book with a good clasp, filled with blank pages, and wrote responses. Short at first, exact, the writing of someone who had been economizing words for so long that using them for anything other than documentation felt frivolous. The stew today was too salty. Hollis is overcorrecting for last night. Does your wolf have a name? Mine, if I have one, has never told me hers. He laughed at the second one. A real laugh, sudden and low, that rearranged the set of his jaw entirely and made him look for a moment like someone younger, someone who had not spent 2 years conducting audits and searching corridors for something he could not describe. "I call him Grey," he said. "He finds this undignified. He has not suggested an alternative." She wrote, "I would also find that undignified. He has standards." "He does." He was deeply unimpressed with my choice of name, and has spent 2 years making that clear by howling at inconvenient moments. She wrote, "In meetings, in a council session reviewing border taxation, 3 senior lords were present. One of them is 79 and has a bad ear." He thought. It was an attack. She almost smiled. The muscles for it had grown more cooperative in 4 days. On the second evening, he asked about her earliest memory, and she thought about it for a long time before writing. A garden. Night flowers, someone singing, I don't know whose voice. He read it twice. Something moved in his expression, careful and slow, like a man approaching something he is not sure he should touch. "We'll find out," he said, "where the garden was, whose it was." On the 4th day they arrived at Voss Gate, the capital, and it was nothing like what she had imagined from descriptions, which had all been about scale. Scale was true. The city spanned a valley wide enough that the far walls were a smudge in the morning haze, but what she had not expected was the specificity of it, the way the central keep rose from its hill like something that had grown there rather than been placed, its old stone walls covered in climbing growth so established it had become structural, its towers catching the afternoon light in amber and grey. Sorin helped her down from the wagon himself. Her feet, bare still, though Ozin had been trying to address this for 3 days, touched the courtyard stone and found it warm. Radiant heated pavement, channels of warm water running beneath the surface. She stopped, looked down, looked up at him. "My mother's design," he said. She hated cold mornings. The specialist's name was Bryn. She was a compact woman in her 50s with the absolute stillness of someone who had spent decades listening to things other people couldn't hear. She examined Vesper's throat and then placed both hands on the sides of Vesper's head and closed her eyes for a very long time. And when she opened them, her expression had moved from clinical to something that Vesper, who read faces the way other people read text, identified as controlled fury. "Her voice is physically intact," Bryn said. Sorin was standing in the corner of the examination room as he had been for the past hour, and she addressed him directly because Vesper had indicated with a gesture that this was fine. Vocal cords, resonance structures, musculature, all present, all functional. She is not mute by nature. "Then why?" Sorin said. "Because someone made her mute." Bryn's voice was flat, a suppression binding. Old technique, significant practitioner skill required, placed when she was very young. 3, possibly 4 years. It's layered through her vocal system and through the presence of her wolf simultaneously. 2 bindings in one working. She paused. Someone didn't want her to be heard. By anyone. For anything. They wanted her completely silent. The room was quiet. "Can you remove it?" Sorin asked. "I can begin the process," Bryn said. "It is not fast work. The binding is old and has grown into her. It will take time and it will be uncomfortable. But yes, I believe I can remove it." She looked at Vesper. "With your consent and your patience, both will be required in significant amounts." Vesper opened her journal. She wrote 1 sentence and held it up. "How do I say yes when I cannot speak?" Bryn looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "You've been saying yes every day for 9 months. Every drawing you made was a yes. This is not different." The unbinding took 11 days. Daily sessions in a room that smelled of cedarwood and hot wax, and something mineral she eventually identified as the stone dust of very old walls. Bryn worked slowly, her hands at Vesper's throat and temples, her concentration so complete and so visible that Vesper had the impression of watching someone do very precise surgery on something that was still in motion. After the 3rd session, something shifted, not in her throat, but behind it, behind the place where the binding pressed. A warmth, a presence, something that moved when she breathed and went still when she held her breath, like an animal that had learned to hide perfectly and was only now, very slowly, deciding to test the air. After the 6th session, she dreamed. In the dream, she was in a garden. Night flowers, white and violet, and the pale acid yellow of things that bloom specifically in the dark, their scent, the sharpest thing in the air, sharper than cold, sharper than the damp stone beneath her feet. And there was a woman in the garden, dark-haired, slight, moving between the flower beds with the focused attention of someone who knows exactly what she is tending and why. The woman's hands were careful. Her hands were Vesper's hands. The same corlused palms, the same ink-dark skin, except the fingers were straight, all of them straight and unhurt. The woman looked up, and her face was not Vesper's face, but it held Vesper's eyes, the same particular shade of dark grey, and she said something, her mouth moving clearly. Vesper could not hear the words, but she understood them the way you understand things in dreams, through the emotion behind the sound rather than the sound itself. She woke already knowing what the woman had said. I named you for the hour before dark, the hour when everything that is going to happen is already decided but has not yet begun. Sorin was outside her door. She knew before she opened it. The bond between them had been settling and clarifying over the 11 days of unbinding, a signal growing less static, and she could feel his proximity now with a precision that was almost spatial. She opened the door. He was leaning against the opposite wall, arms crossed, still in his day clothes, and he looked at her with the slight tension of a man whose wolf had been difficult for the past 20 minutes, and he was managing it mostly through stillness. You were dreaming, he said. She nodded. I felt it. He ran a hand through his hair. Grey, my wolf. He felt whatever your wolf was doing during the dream, and he nearly came forward in the middle of a dinner with 3 ambassadors a pause. They think I have a digestive condition. She pressed her lips together very hard. He noticed. You're almost smiling. She opened her journal and wrote, I dreamed about a garden and a woman. She told me what my name means. He read it and went still. She stepped forward, took his hand and pulled him inside. He went still in the doorway, and she pointed at the bed and held up both hands, palms out. Just sleep, only sleep, nothing else. He looked at her for a long time, then he came inside. He lay on top of the covers, fully dressed, and she lay beside him, and his warmth radiated through the narrow space between them, and the pull in her chest settled into a hum so steady and warm she fell asleep before she had finished noticing it. The binding broke on a Thursday morning. She was in the courtyard with her journal, documenting the growth pattern of a lichen colony on the orthonating wall of the East Tower, because some habits are load-bearing and you do not discard them just because your circumstances have changed. She was mid-sentence when it happened. Not a crack, not a sound. A release, the sensation of a fist that had been clenched so long the clenching had become structural, opening. Fingers she had not known she had, space where there had been compression, and from somewhere deeper than her chest, deeper than anything she had words for, something white and enormous and completely awake surged forward, and she opened her mouth, and the sound that came out was not a scream, was not a word, was a howl, her own voice, the first sound she had made in memory, and it went out of her like a thing that had been stored under pressure for a lifetime, rattling the windows of the courtyard, sending birds off the towers in a spiral of wings, and underneath it the howl changed, deepened, became a key turning in a lock, and her hands hit the ground and her spine asked, and she felt her bones move for the first time. In a way that was right. That was what they were always supposed to do. She shifted. The wolf that emerged was white, not pale, white, the white of quartz under running water, of breath visible in cold air. She was large, larger than she had any context to expect. She stood in the courtyard with her paws on the stone and the autumn air cold against her fur, and she opened her throat and announced herself. I am here. I have always been here. I have not been silent because I had nothing to say. The courtyard erupted. Sorin arrived in under a minute, and he did not arrive in human form. The wolf that came through the gate was grey and scarred and enormous, and it moved with the absolute certainty of a wolf who has spent 2 years looking for something and has now found it in a courtyard 20 feet away. He stopped. His wolf stopped. They looked at each other. He lowered his head. Not submission, recognition. His muzzle pressed against hers, and the sound he made in his chest was the sound wolves make when the searching is finished. The investigation into who had bound her took 8 days. Osin tracked it through records Vesper would not have known how to find, and archivists who specialized in the administrative residue of dissolved packs. The pack was called Aldenmere. Its alpha had been a woman named Vale. Vesper learned her name and felt it settle into her bones, who had held a northern territory notable for 2 things: a white wolf line, rare enough to be documented in 3 separate historical records, and a gift in that line for what the old records called structural sight, the ability to perceive the load-bearing framework of things, buildings, alliances, bodies, systems, the ability to see, precisely and accurately, where the breaking points were. Vale had been murdered. Her territory had been taken by a pack called Stonemore, whose alpha, a man named Taran, had wanted the northern grazing territories for a decade. He could not kill a 3-year-old child, not because he lacked the will, but because Vale, in the final minutes, had called a seer's curse on her daughter's blood. Anyone who spilled it would not outlive the season, along with their line. So Taran had done the next thing. He had hired a practitioner, suppressed the child's wolf and voice, and handed her to a traveling trader with falsified papers, listing her as an unmated omega of no notable lineage, and he had waited. For 15 years he had waited, sending someone through Ashfeld every 2 or 3 years, asking casual questions about the mute girl in the workrooms. Making sure she was still silent, still invisible. He was 61 years old, nothing. He was still Alpha of Stonemore. He was still sitting on land he had taken from a woman he had killed and a child he had silenced. Sorin received this information in his study, with Vesper sitting across from him. Osin delivered the report in her usual tone, factual, precise, structured. When she finished, the room was quiet. Vesper was looking at her hands, her right hand. The crooked fingers that had never fully healed. Her left hand, steady and ink-stained. She was thinking about Taran, about a man she had never met whose decision, made when she was 3 years old, had built the entire architecture of her silence. She was thinking about 15 years of ash drawings and cold corridors and food taken sideways from the edges of counters so no one had to acknowledge giving it. She was not angry. This surprised her. She had expected anger. What she felt instead was tired of the story being the only story she had, and certain, with the same precision she brought to structural assessments, that it should not go unanswered. She wrote in her journal. Her voice was coming back in pieces, a word here, a word there, the vocal cords relearning a language her mouth had never practiced, but she was not yet ready for it in rooms like this one. "I want to be there when you confront him." Sorin read it. He looked up. "You will be," he said. They rode to Stonemore with 200. Vesper rode beside Sorin, not in the wagon, on a bay mare Osin had selected for her, with characteristic precision. She wore clean riding clothes, proper boots, her hair braided back, the scar along her jaw from a tool that had glanced off a wall when she was 14, and caught her face was visible. She had decided, during the 4 days of travel, that it was visible on purpose. It was part of the account. She was not interested in minimizing the account. Taran met them at his gates. He was a tall man, silver-haired and composed in the particular way of someone who was prepared for a day they always knew might come. His eyes were calculating. When they found Vesper, something moved in them. Recognition, then rapid reassessment, then a look she had seen on the faces of pack alphas before. The look of a man whose options have just narrowed to none. Sorin did not give him a greeting. "Alpha Vale of Aldenmere," he said. 15 years ago you had her killed. You stole her territory. You had her daughter's voice and wolf bound by a hired practitioner and delivered her to a border pack under a false name. With instructions she be given nothing, no lineage, no language, no future. You have been checking on her every 2 years since to ensure that she remained nothing. Taran said nothing. He was watching the calculation in his own mind play out, sorting through the same vanishing set of options. We have the practitioner's statement, Sorin said. We have the documents. We have the binding signature, traced to the practitioner's known technique by 2 independent specialists. Taran looked at Vesper again. He looked at her for a long time. Something shifted in his face that was not remorse but was its tired neighbor. She has Vale's eyes, he said, quietly to no one. Sorin's voice went flat and final. You will face tribunal at the capital. Stonemore will be dissolved. Its territory will be returned to the heir of Oldenmere. Taran looked at Vesper. She was a child, he said. You could have killed her, Sorin said. You chose something you believed was worse. You chose to let her exist as nothing. You built 15 years of silence around a person and called it mercy. There was no answer to that. The weariness in Taran's face deepened and he looked away, and the guard stepped forward and it was finished. Vesper watched him go. She waited for the specific relief she had imagined arriving at this moment. What came instead was lighter than she expected, and quieter, the release of a story that had been the whole of her life, ending. And underneath the release, space, room for something else. She turned to Sorin. She opened her mouth and her voice came out rough and low and cracked with 15 years of disuse, barely louder than the wind. I want to see it, she said. Aldenmere, my mother's garden. His face changed. She had learned his face in 23 days of close attention and she knew its ranges, but she had not seen this particular expression before. The look of a man encountering something he had stopped believing in and finding it real. I'll take you there, he said. The claiming happened in Aldenmere's garden, which had gone wild in 15 years of neglect, threading through the ruins of the old Alpha's house and up the crumbling walls and out across the yard in white and violet, and the sharp night-blooming things her mother had planted for reasons Vesper now understood, standing barefoot in the cold earth, better than any account could have given her. The most beautiful things only happen when no one is watching. Sorin stood before her without the coat, without the sword, without the markers of what he was to everyone else in the world. He was a man with tired eyes that were not tired anymore, and a scar someone had given him, and hands that she knew now were as precise as hers in their different way. Vesper, he said, I want to mark you. I want every wolf in this realm to understand that you are mine and I am yours, and that there is nothing they can do about it, and that you are done being nothing to anyone. He paused. But I need you to say yes, in your own voice, the voice you've had for all of 15 days. I need to hear it from you. She thought about the ash drawings. She thought about the 47 images, and the V pressed into the shading of each one, invisible and precise and undeniable. She thought about 9 months of building a record out of silence that no one had asked her to build and everyone had benefited from anyway. She thought about her mother's hands in the dream, moving through flowers that bloomed specifically in the dark. Yes, she said. Her voice cracked on the word. It did not matter. It was hers, and she had chosen this specific word for its first real outing, and she felt the choosing of it in every part of her. He stepped forward, his hand curved around the back of her neck, warm against her skin. She felt his breath against her throat, the press of his canines finding the exact place, and then the bite, sharp and immediate, and then immediately overwhelmed by the warmth that came through the bond like something being completed, like a circuit that has been open for 15 years finally closing. She felt him, not near her, but in her, his heartbeat in her chest, his presence threaded through the bond, and beneath that the white wolf pressing forward, luminous and patient and furious and free, pressing against his grey wolf through the bond and being received. She threw her head back and howled. It went across the ruins of Aldenmere and the wild garden and the stolen territory that was, now finally, hers. The night flowers trembled. Somewhere in the dark above the walls, a flock of birds took off from a tree, startled into flight by a sound they had never heard from this land and would not forget. She marked him in return. Her teeth found the curve of his neck with the determination of someone who has learned precision through necessity, and his blood tasted nothing like her own blood, which had been her most familiar flavor for 15 years. It tasted like the end of a story she was done telling. It tasted like the first line of something else. In the great hall of Vorsgate, the formal presentation happened 3 days later. 200 wolves assembled. The council stood in its row, including a man of 77 named Lord Cress, who was famously difficult and had reportedly never approved of anything in a decade of service, and who looked at Vesper when she walked in beside Sorin with the narrow assessment of someone deciding whether to be impressed or obstructive. Sorin stood before his pack and said 4 words. "This is your queen." Silence. Then Lord Cress stood up. It cost him some effort, and the attendants moved, and he waved them off. He had the voice of a man who had been using it to say difficult things for 50 years. "Vile of Altenmere's daughter," he said. "I knew Vile. She was the most accurate person I have ever met. If she told you the bridge was going to fall, you moved off the bridge, and then she was already on to the next thing she had noticed." He looked at Vesper without blinking. "The daughter drew her warnings in ash because your lot never gave her anything better to write with." He looked at Sorin. "See to it she has whatever she needs. She is an improvement over every advisor you currently employ, and I include myself in that assessment." He sat down. The hall laughed, not at anything ridiculous, but the way people laugh when the pressure has broken, and they are simply glad. And with the laughter something warmer, something that moved through the assembled pack like a key finding a lock. Recognition. The particular recognition of a community encountering someone who belongs in it. Vesper did not address the hall. Her voice was returning in pieces, and she was not ready to deliver it to 200 wolves on 17 days' practice. Instead, she did what she had always done when words failed. She held up her right hand, the one with the crooked fingers, the one that had pressed charred sticks against stone walls for 9 months and built a record no one had asked for and everyone had needed. She held it up so the hall could see, and then she curled it into a fist and pressed it against her heart. "I am here. I have always been here. I am done being hidden. 200 wolves, a ripple moving through them the way wind moves through trees, and then one by one, and then all at once, fists pressed to hearts. The sound of it filled the hall like a single collective heartbeat, 200 people saying the same thing back to her in the only language that required no translation. Sorin's hand found hers. The bond hummed between them, steady and warm, the signal that had spent 2 years searching for its source and had finally arrived. She did not cry. She was not made for public crying and probably would never be. What she felt instead was the specific, quiet, architectural satisfaction of a load-bearing thing finally being placed correctly. The right structure, the right position, the weight, distributed exactly as it was meant to be. In the north corridor of Ashfeld Keep, the ash was fading from the walls. Rain had gotten into the old keep through the gap in the east roof that no one had repaired because Merrick was awaiting tribunal and Von was awaiting tribunal, and there was no steward to order the repair. Water was doing what scrubbing had never done, dissolving the marks in long pale streaks, returning the stone to its original face. The drawings dissolved last. The granary schematic, the well cover, the medication records, the 47 images with their invisible signatures pressed into the shading, all of it returning to stone. Last of all, in the corner of the receiving corridor where the wall met the floor, the smallest mark of all, a V, looped at the top, precise and certain and specific, held longest against the water. Then that too was gone. She did not need the walls anymore.